Introduction: A hidden talent. Elijah Jones had always been an artist, even before he had the words to describe himself as one. Growing up in a small, predominantly black neighborhood in Atlanta, his earliest canvases were scraps of cardboard, and his brushes were the twigs he dipped into mud after a rainstorm. Despite his humble beginnings, Elijah had a natural gift for capturing emotion, turning the mundane into the extraordinary. His art was a blend of vivid colors and intricate details, each piece telling a story of resilience, love, and hope. Yet, talent wasn't enough in a world where connections and privilege often outweighed skill. Elijah was no stranger to rejection. Despite graduating at the top of his class from a prestigious art school on a full scholarship, doors to high-end galleries and exhibitions remained closed to him. The rejections were rarely explicit, but the undertone was always the same: he didn't fit the brand. The art world, dominated by wealthy collectors and gatekeepers, had little room for someone like Elijah, whose work spoke to the struggles and triumphs of people often ignored in their circles. One rainy afternoon, dressed in his best but still modest attire, a neatly pressed white shirt and slacks, Elijah walked into one of the most renowned galleries in New York City, Langley Fine Arts. The walls were lined with the works of celebrated artists, each piece framed in gilded gold. The air smelled faintly of lavender and wealth. Clutching his portfolio tightly, Elijah approached the front desk, where a young assistant gave him a once-over. "I'm here to see Mr. Langley," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous thrum in his chest. The assistant raised an eyebrow but gestured toward a door at the back. Moments later, Elijah found himself standing in the office of Mr. Charles Langley, the gallery's owner. Langley was a middle-aged man with salt-and-pepper hair, slicked back meticulously. His tailored suit and Italian loafers spoke of someone who had never known a day of struggle. He looked up from his desk, his piercing blue eyes scanning Elijah in a way that made him feel small. "What can I do for you?" Langley asked, his tone laced with disinterest. "I'm an artist," Elijah began, setting his portfolio on the desk and opening it. "I was hoping you'd consider displaying some of my work." Langley leaned back in his chair, barely glancing at the pieces Elijah laid out. The vibrant paintings depicted scenes of everyday life: children playing in the streets, elders sharing wisdom on porches, and mothers cradling their children, their faces etched with both weariness and love. Each piece seemed alive, bursting with emotion and stories. But Langley wasn't interested in the stories. "This isn't really what our clientele is looking for," he said, closing the portfolio without a second glance. "Your style is too raw. Too urban." Elijah bristled. "With all due respect, sir, art is meant to evoke emotion. My work—" Langley cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I know what art is meant to do, young man. But this? It's not refined enough. It lacks sophistication." The word stung, but it was the smirk on Langley's face that twisted the knife. "Perhaps you'd have better luck at one of those community centers. They're always looking for unique pieces like this." Elijah's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to argue, to demand that Langley explain what he meant by unique, but he knew it would be futile. People like Langley didn't listen to people like him. "I see," Elijah said finally, his voice tight. He gathered his portfolio, careful not to let his frustration show, and stood. "Thank you for your time." As he walked out of the gallery, the rain outside seemed fitting, a mirror to the storm brewing inside him. But as much as Langley's words had hurt, they had also ignited something within Elijah. He wasn't just going to prove Langley wrong, he was going to make sure the entire art world recognized his worth. Standing under the rain-soaked awning, Elijah made a silent promise to himself: this wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning. The rise of an underrated artist. Elijah's resolve didn't waver after his humiliating encounter at Langley Fine Arts. He returned to his tiny studio apartment, a cluttered space barely large enough to hold his canvases and supplies. Despite the discouragement, he threw himself into his work. Each brushstroke became a declaration, each canvas a testament to his defiance. He painted through the nights, pouring his emotions into every piece: love, anger, hope, and a fierce determination to prove his worth. His breakthrough came not from a glitzy gallery but from an unexpected opportunity at a community art fair held in Harlem. The fair, modest in scale, was a space where local artists showcased their work to a diverse audience. It was far from the glossy, white-walled galleries of Manhattan, but it was vibrant and full of life, much like Elijah's art. The morning of the fair, Elijah set up his modest booth with care. He displayed his best pieces, a series of paintings he called Echoes of Us. The series depicted scenes from everyday Black life: an elderly couple dancing in their living room, children playing jump rope on cracked sidewalks, a preacher delivering a fiery sermon to a congregation whose faces radiated both struggle and strength. Each painting was a window into a world often overlooked, imbued with raw emotion and vivid storytelling. As the day progressed, Elijah noticed a steady trickle of visitors stopping by his booth. Many admired his work, some even purchased smaller prints, but it wasn't until late afternoon that everything changed. A tall man with a silver mane of hair and a sharp suit strolled through the fair, drawing attention wherever he went. Elijah didn't know it at the time, but this was Arthur Gainsborough, one of the most influential art critics in the world. Gainsborough was known for his discerning eye and his knack for discovering hidden gems. When Gainsborough reached Elijah's booth, he stopped abruptly. His eyes scanned the paintings, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped closer, leaning in to examine the intricate details of a piece titled Legacy of Love. The painting depicted a grandmother braiding her granddaughter's hair, their faces lit by the warm glow of a setting sun. The love between them practically radiated off the canvas. "This," Gainsborough finally said, his voice tinged with awe, "is extraordinary." Elijah, taken aback, stammered a polite thank you. Gainsborough asked questions about Elijah's inspirations, his technique, and his journey as an artist. Elijah answered humbly, unsure of the man's identity but grateful for his genuine interest. The next morning, Elijah's phone buzzed incessantly. Friends and fellow artists flooded him with messages. "Have you seen the review?" Confused, Elijah opened his laptop and found an article in the New York Times. The headline read, "A Rising Star in Harlem, the Unmissable Art of Elijah Jones." Gainsborough had written a glowing review, calling Elijah's work a masterclass in emotional storytelling and a poignant reminder of the beauty and resilience in everyday life. The article went viral, and Elijah's life changed overnight. Within days, Elijah received emails and calls from galleries, curators, and collectors eager to work with him. Prestigious venues that had once ignored him were now offering him prime exhibition slots. His paintings, once dismissed as raw and urban, were now celebrated as groundbreaking and authentic. One of his first major exhibitions was held at a gallery in Chelsea, a hub for contemporary art. The opening night was a whirlwind of flashing cameras, flowing champagne, and whispers of awe as attendees admired Elijah's work. Collectors lined up to purchase his pieces, and by the end of the night, nearly every painting was sold, some for tens of thousands of dollars. Elijah's rise wasn't just about financial success, it was about validation. For years, he had been told his art wasn't refined enough, that it didn't belong in the upper echelons of the art world. Now, those same gatekeepers were clamoring for a chance to represent him. Meanwhile, across town, Mr. Langley remained blissfully unaware of Elijah's meteoric ascent. His gallery continued to cater to its usual clientele, wealthy elites seeking safe, predictable art that matched their decor. Langley's arrogance had blinded him to the shifts happening in the art world, where authenticity and emotion were beginning to overshadow tradition and pretension. One evening, as Langley entertained a group of collectors at his gallery, a guest mentioned Elijah's name. "Have you seen Elijah Jones's work? It's remarkable. They say his pieces are selling faster than anything on the market." Langley scoffed. "Never heard of him," he said dismissively. Probably another flash in the pan. But Langley's ignorance would soon be shattered. Elijah wasn't just a rising star, he was a force, and his journey was far from over. A twist of fate. Elijah's life had transformed beyond recognition. What had started as a dream born in the streets of Atlanta had become an international sensation. His art, now considered revolutionary, was celebrated for its raw emotion and intricate storytelling. Major museums, collectors, and even celebrities clamored for his work. Pieces that once struggled to fetch a few $100s were now auctioning for millions. At an international art auction in Paris, one of his most iconic pieces, Legacy of Love, sold for $5.2 million, shattering records for a contemporary artist. Art critics praised his ability to bridge the gap between realism and emotional abstraction, calling him a modern-day master. Elijah, however, remained grounded, never forgetting the struggles that had shaped him or the community that had nurtured his talent. With his newfound wealth, Elijah decided to give back, not just to his community but to the art world as a whole. He purchased properties and transformed them into spaces for aspiring artists to display their work. He also acquired several smaller galleries, providing opportunities for underrepresented talent. Elijah was no longer just an artist, he was becoming a patron of the arts, using his influence to dismantle the very barriers that had once held him back. Meanwhile, across town, Langley Fine Arts was in trouble. Mr. Langley's arrogance and refusal to adapt had left the gallery outdated and struggling to attract new clientele. The art world was shifting, with collectors seeking bold, authentic pieces that resonated emotionally rather than traditional works that fit neatly into conventional molds. Langley, however, clung to his old ways, dismissing these changes as trends. His gallery's finances were in shambles. Monthly revenues barely covered operational costs, and several high-profile collectors had taken their business elsewhere. To save his gallery, Langley decided to organize an exclusive networking event, hoping to attract wealthy investors who might be willing to inject much-needed capital into his failing business. The event was to be a grand affair. Langley spared no expense, hiring caterers, a live string quartet, and even a renowned sommelier to impress his guests. Invitations were sent to the city's elite, promising an evening of fine art, networking, and exclusivity. Unbeknownst to Langley, one of those invitations made its way to Elijah. A colleague, amused by the irony, had forwarded it with a note, "I think you'll find this interesting." Elijah read the invitation and felt a mix of emotions, amusement, curiosity, and a lingering sting of the rejection he'd faced in that very gallery years ago. It had been a long time since that rainy afternoon when Langley had dismissed him, but the memory was still vivid. After some thought, Elijah decided to attend the event. But he wouldn't go as the young, struggling artist Langley had mocked. He would go as the man he had become, a wealthy, influential buyer whose presence could make or break a gallery's reputation. The night of the event, Langley Fine Arts was bathed in warm golden light, its exterior glowing with a false sense of prosperity. Inside, the gallery was crowded with impeccably dressed guests sipping champagne and discussing art in hushed, pretentious tones. Langley, dressed in a tailored tuxedo, floated through the room, greeting guests with the practiced charm of a man desperate to impress. Elijah arrived late, stepping out of a sleek black car that turned heads as it pulled up to the gallery. He was dressed in an elegant suit, tailored to perfection, and his wrist bore a timepiece that silently declared his wealth. A pair of dark sunglasses and a polished demeanor completed the transformation. As he entered the gallery, the room seemed to pause for a moment. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd, but no one recognized him immediately. To most, he was just another wealthy patron. Langley approached Elijah, unaware of his identity but eager to engage with someone who so clearly fit the profile of an investor. "Good evening," Langley said with a practiced smile. "I don't believe we've met before." "Charles Langley, owner of this fine establishment." Elijah extended his hand, his voice calm and measured. "Elijah Jones," he replied, offering no further details. Langley's smile widened, his eyes scanning Elijah's attire and immediately calculating his potential as a donor. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Jones. Are you an art collector?" "You could say that," Elijah replied, his lips curling into a subtle smile. "I've been known to acquire a piece or two." The confrontation. The grand networking event at Langley Fine Arts was in full swing. Champagne glasses clinked, laughter mingled with the soft strains of a string quartet, and conversations buzzed about art, business, and society. Elijah moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, observing the art, the guests, and, most of all, Charles Langley. Langley, oblivious to Elijah's identity, had spent most of the evening playing host. He continued his rounds, charming his guests, dropping names, and steering conversations toward his desperate pitch for investors. His polished exterior masked the mounting pressure he was under. Tonight's success was his last hope to save the gallery. When Langley spotted Elijah standing near a large, abstract painting, he approached with his trademark air of condescension. He still didn't recognize Elijah as the young artist he had dismissed years ago, and his tone carried the same dismissive edge. "Ah, Mr. Jones," Langley said, extending his hand. "I see you're admiring this piece. One of our most celebrated artists. Quite a collector's item, wouldn't you agree?" Elijah raised an eyebrow, glancing at the painting. It was technically skilled but lacked soul, a piece clearly chosen for its marketability rather than its ability to evoke emotion. He gave a noncommittal nod. "It's interesting." Langley chuckled, mistaking Elijah's understatement for agreement. "I thought so. A refined eye can always appreciate the subtleties. It's rare to find collectors who truly understand the nuances of art these days." Elijah smiled faintly. "Nuance, yes. But don't you think art should also tell a story? Shouldn't it connect with people on a deeper level?" Langley tilted his head, considering the question as if it were trivial. "Perhaps, but in the end, what matters is what sells. Emotion is all well and good, but sophistication is what defines success in this business. Some styles," he said, with a faint sneer, "lack the polish needed to thrive in galleries like this." The remark struck a nerve, bringing Elijah back to that rainy afternoon years ago. He decided it was time to reveal the truth. "Fascinating perspective, Mr. Langley," Elijah said, his voice steady but carrying a subtle edge. "I wonder, though, if you felt the same way when you dismissed my portfolio years ago." Langley froze, his confident demeanor faltering as he stared at Elijah. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. "I'm sorry," Langley said, frowning. "Have we met before?" Elijah chuckled softly, the sound carrying through the room and catching the attention of nearby guests. "Yes, we have. Several years ago, I stood in this very gallery, portfolio in hand, hoping to showcase my work. You barely glanced at it before dismissing me as too raw and too urban." Langley led Elijah through the gallery, pointing out various works and boasting about the gallery's history. He made vague references to his extensive network and the unparalleled opportunities available to anyone willing to invest in the gallery's future. Elijah listened politely, his sharp eyes taking in the state of the gallery. The once pristine walls showed signs of wear, and the art on display, while technically impressive, lacked soul. It was clear that Langley's refusal to evolve had left him stranded in a rapidly changing industry. As the evening progressed, Langley grew more insistent, subtly steering the conversation toward potential investments. "A gallery like this," he said, "isn't just a business, it's a legacy. With the right backing, we could expand, bring in fresh talent, host international exhibitions. The possibilities are endless." Elijah, still playing the part of an anonymous investor, nodded thoughtfully. "It's an intriguing proposition," he said. "But tell me, what's your stance on showcasing unconventional or emerging artists?" Langley's expression flickered for a moment, but he recovered quickly. "Well, of course, we support innovation," he said, his tone rehearsed. "But we cater to a discerning clientele. They expect a certain caliber of work." Elijah's smile didn't falter, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of amusement. "I see. And how do you determine that caliber?" Langley waved a hand dismissively. "It's about refinement, sophistication. Some styles, while interesting, don't quite align with the image we maintain." Elijah chuckled softly. "Interesting perspective. I suppose that's what separates struggling galleries from thriving ones." Langley stiffened slightly, unsure if Elijah's comment was a subtle jab or a casual observation. He decided to let it slide, eager not to offend a potential investor. As the evening wound down, Elijah excused himself, promising to think about Langley's proposal. He left the gallery with a plan already forming in his mind. Langley had once dismissed him, but now the tables had turned. Elijah wasn't just an artist anymore, he was a power player in the very world that had once tried to shut him out. And Langley, whether he knew it or not, was about to learn the true value of the man he had underestimated. A hush fell over the crowd as more guests turned to watch the unfolding exchange. Langley's face paled as murmurs rippled through the room. The name Elijah Jones began to spread among the attendees like wildfire. You're that Elijah Jones? Langley stammered, his bravado crumbling as he realized who he was speaking to. Yes, Elijah said calmly. The same Elijah Jones whose work is now sold in international auctions for millions. The same Elijah Jones whose name you dismissed without a second thought. Langley opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The crowd around them had grown, with many guests whispering in astonishment and pointing toward Elijah. He was no longer the anonymous investor they had speculated about, he was a celebrated artist and one of the most sought-after figures in the art world. Mr. Langley, Elijah continued, his voice firm but not unkind, what you failed to see back then was that art isn't about fitting into narrow definitions of sophistication. It's about connection, emotion, and the stories that need to be told. You mocked my work because it didn't align with your vision of what art should be. But you were wrong. Langley's face turned crimson as the weight of the public humiliation settled on him. I didn't mean to. Elijah held up a hand, silencing him. You didn't mean to see beyond your own biases. That's clear. But I'm not here to dwell on the past. I've moved forward. The question is, have you? The crowd murmured in agreement, and Langley looked as though he wished the floor would swallow him whole. Elijah let the silence stretch for a moment before he continued. I came here tonight not as the young artist you dismissed, but as a buyer. And I'm prepared to make an offer for this gallery. Gasps rippled through the room, and Langley's eyes widened in shock. You want to buy the gallery? Yes, Elijah said. But under one condition. If I take ownership, this gallery will no longer be a monument to exclusivity and narrow-mindedness. It will become a space that champions diversity, emerging artists, and the kind of stories you once mocked. It will stand for the very ideals you ignored. Langley blinked, his expression a mixture of disbelief and desperation. He knew he had no choice. Without Elijah's offer, the gallery would almost certainly collapse under its mounting debts. I think we can make that work, Langley said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah nodded, then turned to the crowd. Art should be a reflection of the world, not a sanitized version of it. I believe this gallery can become a place where all artists, regardless of their background, have a chance to shine. The room erupted in applause, and Langley, defeated, could only nod along. Elijah had not only reclaimed his dignity but also turned the tables, ensuring that Langley's gallery would now stand for everything it had once excluded. Transformation and redemption. Mr. Langley agrees to sell, and Elijah transforms the gallery into a vibrant space for underrepresented artists. The story concludes with an art exhibit that celebrates the power of perseverance and inclusivity, transformation and redemption. The deal was finalized within weeks. Mr. Langley, humbled and resigned, signed over the gallery to Elijah in exchange for enough funds to settle his debts and retire quietly. For Langley, it was the end of an era he had clung to for far too long. For Elijah, it was the beginning of something far greater, a space that would redefine what a gallery could be. A new vision for Langley Fine Arts. Elijah wasted no time transforming the gallery. The pristine white walls were replaced with textured backdrops, warm lighting, and bold, vibrant colors that mirrored the diversity of the artists whose work would now fill the space. The gallery's name was changed to the Mosaic Collective, symbolizing the richness that comes from blending different perspectives and voices. Instead of featuring the same predictable roster of artists, Elijah invited creators from all walks of life, painters, sculptors, photographers, and mixed-media artists who had often been overlooked by mainstream galleries. His focus was on underrepresented groups, women, people of color, LGBTQ+ artists, and those from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. The selection process wasn't about fitting into outdated molds, but about showcasing work that resonated deeply, work that told real stories. The Mosaic Collective became more than just a gallery, it was a hub for creativity and community. Elijah introduced workshops, mentorship programs, and artist residencies, offering emerging talents resources he had once struggled to find. He also established scholarships for young artists, ensuring they had the financial means to pursue their dreams. Langley, though no longer involved, occasionally stopped by. He was hesitant at first, worried he would be met with disdain, but Elijah welcomed him without judgment. Watching the transformation of his former gallery, Langley began to see the possibilities he had once dismissed. Slowly, he started volunteering as a mentor for young artists, sharing the business knowledge he'd gained over decades. It wasn't a complete redemption, but it was a start. The grand reopening. 6 months later, the Mosaic Collective was ready for its grand reopening. The night was electric, the gallery buzzing with energy and excitement. Guests from all walks of life filled the space, young artists eager to see their work displayed, seasoned collectors intrigued by Elijah's vision, and members of the community who had never felt welcome in such spaces before. The centerpiece of the evening was an exhibit titled Threads of Resilience, a collection of works that celebrated the power of perseverance and inclusivity. Each piece told a story of overcoming adversity, of triumph in the face of hardship. One section featured the work of emerging artists mentored by Elijah himself, while another showcased pieces from established creators who had faced similar struggles in their early careers. Elijah's own painting, Unbroken, held a prominent place in the exhibit. The massive canvas depicted a figure walking through a storm, their face illuminated with quiet determination as they carried a lantern that lit the path ahead. It was a deeply personal piece, a reflection of Elijah's journey and a beacon of hope for others. As guests mingled, Elijah stood near the entrance, watching the space come alive. He saw young artists explaining their work to intrigued collectors, children marveling at sculptures, and seasoned critics nodding in approval. This was the gallery he had dreamed of, a place where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel the power of art. A full circle moment. Toward the end of the evening, Elijah spotted Langley standing near a vibrant painting created by a teenage artist from Harlem. Langley's expression was thoughtful, almost reverent. Elijah approached him, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It's a powerful piece, isn't it?" Elijah said. Langley nodded. "It is. Raw, emotional, but also sophisticated in its own way." He glanced at Elijah, a flicker of a smile crossing his face. "I suppose I was wrong about a lot of things." Elijah shrugged, his tone light. "We all have room to grow." Langley extended his hand, and Elijah shook it. There were no grand apologies, no sweeping declarations of regret, but the gesture was enough.